June 6, 1944, the skies over Normandy. On this day, more than 14,000 Allied aircraft flew over the invasion beaches. 14,000. Fighters, bombers, transport planes, an aerial armada the world had never seen before. And how many Luftwaffe aircraft rose to stop this invasion? 319. 319 sorties against 14,000. Of those, only 2 German aircraft, just 2, actually attacked the landing beaches. 2 pilots in 2 Focke-Wulf 190s swept over Sword Beach, fired their guns, and vanished. That was the entire air defense of the Third Reich on the most important day of World War II. But let's figure this out. How was this even possible? How did a country that produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft in 1939 come to build 96,218 aircraft by 1944 and suffocate in the skies a nation that had terrorized Europe for 5 years? The answer isn't in politics, it's not in ideology. The answer lies in a production line a mile long, in a Danish immigrant who became a 3-star general, and in the fatal mistake of one man with a marshal's baton. This isn't just a war story. This is a forensic audit of the most massive industrial killing in history. This is the story of how American factories drove the final nail into the Luftwaffe's coffin. Buckle up! Section 1. The Pentagon's Black Friday. Nail number 1. An army the size of Portugal. May 1940. France would fall within 3 weeks. Britain stood alone. And what about the United States? Let's look at numbers that should cause you physical pain. In 1940, the American army numbered around 270,000 men. It was the 12th largest army in the world, behind Brazil, behind Romania. The army of the greatest industrial power on the planet was smaller than Portugal's. They had 32 tanks. 32. The Battle of France that same month involved nearly 6,000 tanks on both sides. But the most shocking figure concerned aviation. The U.S. Army Air Corps had approximately 1,100 aircraft. Most of them obsolete. The Luftwaffe at that point had more than 4,000 modern combat machines. And in this situation, on May 16, 1940, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stepped up to the podium in Congress and spoke a number that made half the chamber think he had lost his mind. 50,000 aircraft per year. Not 5,000, not 10,000, 50,000. A country that had produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft in 1939 was supposed to increase production 17-fold in a matter of months. When Hitler was informed of these plans, his advisors reassured the Führer this was American propaganda, a bluff. A country that makes refrigerators and razor blades cannot build bombers. Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, just laughed. The Americans? Oh yes, they make excellent razors and refrigerators. This was the first fatal mistake. Section 2. The man who worked for $1 a year. Nail number 2. A Danish immigrant against the Nazi machine. To understand how America achieved the impossible, you need to meet the man who organized it, and his story is pure Hollywood material. William Cygnus Knudsen was born in Copenhagen in 1879. In 1900, he arrived in New York with a suitcase and a few dollars in his pocket. His birth name, Cygnus Wilhelm Poul Knudsen, was too long for the American foreman at the shipyard, who simply wrote him down as William S. Knudsen, or Bill. And so a Danish mechanic became Big Bill, the man who would change the history of the 20th century. Knudsen started working at a bicycle factory in Buffalo. When Ford Motor Company bought the factory in 1911, Knudsen found himself at the epicenter of the greatest manufacturing revolution in history. He worked at the Highland Park plant, the very one where Henry Ford created the world's first automobile assembly line. But Knudsen didn't just learn. He improved. He could bark orders in 15 languages. Workers at the plant spoke different languages, and Knudsen learned key phrases in each one. By 1921, he had become so good that he started irritating Henry Ford himself. Knudsen left, and within a few years became president of Chevrolet, then president of all of General Motors. Under his leadership, Chevrolet outsold Ford for the first time. When Roosevelt was looking for someone capable of turning American industry into a war machine in 1940, he was asked, "Who do you want for this job?" The answer came from financier Bernard Baruch, who had coordinated American mobilization during World War I. First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen. And here's where it gets interesting. Roosevelt called Knudsen and asked him to head the advisory commission to the Council of National Defense. Knudsen agreed. His salary, $1 a year. The president of General Motors, a man with a salary in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, left the corporation to work for the government for a symbolic fee. He paid for his own travel, hotels, and meals. Later, when political intrigues in Washington forced him out of his civilian position, Roosevelt offered him something unprecedented: direct commissioning as a lieutenant general in the United States Army. 3 stars. This was the only time in history that a civilian received such a high rank directly. "Bill," Roosevelt told him, "I want you to accept this rank. When you arrive at a factory, there might be generals who will try to push you around. They won't be able to, because you'll outrank them." On January 28, 1942, a Danish immigrant who started as a mechanic at a bicycle factory became a 3-star general. And under his leadership, American industry accomplished what Göring thought impossible. Section 3. The factory a mile long. Nail number 3. Willow Run. Miracle or madness? December 1940. Britain was begging for bombers. Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall delivered shocking news to Roosevelt. The entire American army had only 32 heavy bombers left. If they gave them to the British, they'd have nothing to train their own crews with. Knudsen understood. A completely new approach was needed. In January 1941, Charles Sorensen, Ford Motor Company's vice president of production, flew to San Diego to see how Consolidated Aircraft assembled the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber. What he saw shocked him. The aircraft were assembled practically by hand. Workers squatted inside fuselages. Each plane was slightly different. Blueprints? There practically weren't any. Many parts existed only in the heads of experienced craftsmen. Consolidated was producing B-24s at the rate of 1 aircraft per day. 1. Sorensen didn't sleep that night. By 4 in the morning, he had a sketch on a napkin from the Hotel del Coronado, a plan for a factory a mile long, with an assembly line that would produce 1 bomber per hour. 1 bomber per hour, 24 bombers per day, versus 1 per day at Consolidated. When he showed this plan to aviation industry executives, they tapped their temples. "You can't build aircraft like automobiles," they told him. "It's completely different technology." Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, smirked. "You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight." But Ford started building. They chose a location on a farm personally owned by Henry Ford, a plot called Willow Run. Construction began in April 1941. By 1942, the world's largest factory under one roof had risen here. 3.5 million square feet, that's 325,000 square meters. For comparison, that's roughly 45 football fields. The main assembly line stretched for a mile, but there was one engineering quirk. The line made a sharp 90-degree turn at the end. Why? Because if it had gone straight, the factory would have ended up in 2 different counties, and the tax consequences would have been catastrophic. For this turn, engineers installed giant turntables, platforms that rotated the unfinished bombers 90 degrees and sent them further down the line. The B-24 Liberator consisted of 450,000 individual parts and 360,000 rivets of 550 different sizes. Its length, 67 feet, wingspan, 110 feet, weight, 36,000 pounds. And Ford was going to build it like the Model T. Section 4. Will it run? Nail number 4. The Willow Run Crisis. The first months of Willow Run's operation were a disaster. In 1942, the factory produced just 56 aircraft. 56 for an entire year. Journalists allowed into the plant saw giant empty halls, workers who didn't know what to do, and mountains of defective parts. The press began to mock them. The Detroit Free Press had promised that Willow Run would produce a bomber a minute. When that didn't happen, journalists renamed the factory Will It Run. There were several problems. First, Consolidated kept changing the B-24's design. Each change meant Ford had to reconfigure the entire production process. In the first year, Ford engineers created 30,000 blueprints based on Consolidated's materials, and 10,000 of them were obsolete by the time they were finished. Second, Ford was trying to apply automobile methods to aviation. An automobile assembly line works with a frozen design. The car doesn't change for years. A military aircraft changes every week because combat experience demands improvements. Third, there weren't enough workers. Men were leaving for the front, and the women who came to replace them had never worked in factories before. Senator Harry Truman, the same one who would later become president, chaired the committee investigating military expenditures. He visited Willow Run twice, and both times left disappointed. "I don't need excuses," he said. "I need finished bombers." But then something changed. Section 5. Roses among the rivets. Nail number 5. The Army of Housewives. By May 1942, 15% of Willow Run's workforce were women. By summer 1943, 42,000 people worked at the plant, and a significant portion of them were women. One of them was named Rose Will Monroe. Rose was a widow from Kentucky. Her husband had died in a car accident, and she moved to Michigan looking for work. She got a job as a riveter at Willow Run, someone who drives rivets into the aluminum skin of aircraft. One day, actor Walter Pidgeon came to the factory to film a war bonds promotional film. He needed a typical American worker, and he found Rose. Thus was born the legend of Rosie the Riveter. In reality, the Rosie image was a composite. There were other women: Rosalind Walker, who inspired the popular song, Geraldine Doyle, whose photo became the basis for the "We Can Do It" poster, Naomi Parker Fraley, who was photographed at a machine at an airbase in California. But the fact remains, the women of Willow Run were doing work that men had thought impossible. Between 1941 and 1944, the number of working women in the U.S. grew from 10.8 million to 18 million. In the aviation industry, women reached 65% of the workforce versus 1% before the war. They were paid 85 cents an hour, the same as men in the same position. This was revolutionary. Government propaganda explained to women, if you can sew, you can rivet. If you can bake pies, you can work on an assembly line. And it worked. By summer 1944, Willow Run had overcome all its problems. Production reached its peak, one B-24 every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In April 1944, the factory produced 428 bombers in 1 month. Between April 24th and 26th, 100 completed B-24s rolled off the line in 3 days. At one point, the Army literally said, "Slow down, we have nowhere to park them." Combat losses turned out to be less than we expected. By the end of the war, Willow Run had produced 8,685 B-24 bombers, nearly half of all ever built. 92 million pounds of aluminum aviation. Section 6, Apocalyptic Numbers. Nail them at 6, Statistics that killed the Reich. Let's stop and look at the numbers, because the numbers are the verdict. In 1939, the US produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. In 1940, about 6,000. In 1941, 19,433. In 1942, 47,836. In 1943, 85,998. In 1944, 96,308. Throughout the entire war, American industry produced more than 300,000 military aircraft. Now let's compare with Germany. Throughout the entire war, from 1939 to 1945, Germany produced approximately 119,000 aircraft. America in 1944 alone produced nearly as many as Germany did during the entire war. But that's not all. The Japanese Empire produced approximately 76,000 aircraft throughout the entire war. America in 1944 produced more aircraft than Japan did during the entire war. The Allies, the US, Great Britain, and the USSR together produced nearly 600,000 aircraft versus 158,000 for the Axis powers, a ratio of nearly 4-1. As Knudsen himself said after the war, "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production the likes of which he had never seen and never dreamed of." This wasn't just victory, this was industrial murder. Section 7, Ignored Warnings. Nailed them as 7, The Man Who Knew the Truth. But was this avalanche unexpected for the Germans? Did no one warn them? There was one man, and his story is a tragedy worthy of Shakespeare. Friedrich von Boertcher was the only German military attaché in the US between the two world wars. He served in Washington from 1933 to 1941, 8 critical years. Boertcher's mother was American. He spoke English fluently. He loved American military history. He had close ties to officers in the American War Department, so close that he supplied them with information about German aviation, even during the Battle of Britain. Boertcher sent detailed reports to Berlin about the state of American industry. He saw the factories. He talked to engineers. He understood what this country was capable of. But his reports were contradictory. On one hand, he respected American industrial potential. On the other, he believed America would need at least 2 years to deploy it at full capacity. And that isolationist sentiment in the country was stronger than the desire to fight. Hitler heard what he wanted to hear. By the time the Americans came, it would be too late. This was the second fatal mistake. After the war, Boetticher was accused of underestimating the Americans and misleading Hitler with overly optimistic reports. Historian Alfred Beck, who studied the archives, proved that reality was more complex. Boetticher told the truth about the potential, but his words drowned in Nazi overconfidence. The Führer and his circle simply couldn't believe that a half-Jewish, half-Negro nation, in their own words, was capable of such a production miracle. They were wrong. Section 8. The speech that changed everything. Nailed number 8. Arsenal of Democracy. December 29, 1940. Roosevelt sits before a microphone in the White House. This is his 16th fireside chat, a radio address to the nation. Europe is on fire. Britain is under siege. American isolationists demand staying out of the European war. And Roosevelt speaks words that will go down in history. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war. Arsenal of democracy. This phrase became a symbol. Some attribute it to Roosevelt's advisor Harry Hopkins, others to French economist Jean Monnet, still others to Knudsen himself. It doesn't matter who coined it. What matters is that America heard it. Roosevelt didn't promise to send American soldiers to Europe. He promised something else. Weapons, aircraft, tanks, ships, everything needed so the British and their allies could fight. 3 months later, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, a program under which the U.S. loaned military equipment to allies. By the end of the war, Lend-Lease had delivered $50 billion worth of materials, about $700 billion in today's dollars. But Lend-Lease was just the beginning. After Pearl Harbor, on December 7, 1941, American industry shifted to total war mode. Automobile factories stopped producing civilian cars completely. Where Cadillacs and Chevrolets were once assembled, they now made tanks, trucks, and aircraft. General Motors, Knudsen's former company, became the country's largest military contractor. By the end of the war, it had supplied $12.3 billion worth of military materials, about $147 billion in today's dollars. One company, Section 9, Big Week. Nail number 9, the aerial genocide of the Luftwaffe. February 1944, Operation Argument, which pilots simply called Big Week. For 6 straight days, February 20th to 25, thousands of American and British bombers attacked German aircraft factories. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Messerschmitt, Heinkel, Junkers, Focke-Wulf. German fighters rose to defend. This was exactly what the Allies wanted. By early 1944, the Americans had a secret weapon, the P-51 Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. This fighter could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. For the first time in history, heavy bombers had adequate protection along the entire route, and the Luftwaffe bled out. From January to June 1944, 5 months before D-Day, 2,262 German fighter pilots were killed. In May 1944, 1 month before the invasion, 25% of the entire Luftwaffe fighter force was killed. In March 1944, 56% of available German fighters were lost. In April, 43%. In May, over 50%. This was aerial genocide. German factories continued producing aircraft, but there were no pilots left who could fly them. Recruits received minimal training and died in their first battles. As German pilot Fritz Engau recalled, on the invasion front, Allied superiority was particularly great. Mustangs circled over every crossroads, every junction, every railway station. We suffered monstrous losses. By June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe in Western Europe had been wiped out. That's why 14,000 Allied aircraft faced 319 German sorties. That's why only 2 fighters attacked the D-Day beaches. The Nazi sky died in February, 4 months before the invasion. Section 10, Göring in Captivity, the Final Confession. Nail number 10, the Fall of the Reichsmarschall. May 1945. Hermann Göring surrenders to the Americans in Austria. By this point, he was no longer the man who laughed at American razors and refrigerators. He had lost Hitler's favor. His Luftwaffe was destroyed. His health was ruined. Years of morphine addiction and serious weight problems had turned the once dashing fighter ace into a shadow of his former self. In American captivity, he was weaned off drugs. He lost weight. His mind cleared. And now he testified. In interrogations after the surrender, Göring was surprisingly candid about his mistakes. "I told Hitler that I considered it my duty to prevent America from going to war against us," he confessed. "I believed the economic and technical potential of the United States to be unusually great, particularly in aviation. I always told Hitler that it would be comparatively easy to convert American factories for war production, especially the mighty automobile industry. He knew, he understood the danger, and still underestimated the scale." When American General Karl Spaatz asked Göring what had been the most effective Allied weapon, he answered without hesitation, "Precision bombing, because it was decisive. Destroyed cities could be evacuated, but destroyed industry could not." When asked about the future of aviation, Göring dreamily discussed jet aircraft that could fly to America and back. The Me-264, the America bomber, existed in blueprints, but there was no fuel for it, no pilots. The factories were being bombed every day. On October 1st, 1946, Göring was found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to wage war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He asked to be shot, like a soldier. He was refused. Hanging was ordered. On October 15th, 1946, 2 hours before his execution, Göring took cyanide. The capsule was probably passed to him by one of the American guards. He was cremated at Dachau. His ashes were dumped in a garbage bin. Thus ended the journey of the man who laughed at American refrigerators. Section 11, the final bill. Verdict, forensic summary. Let's sum up. Let's look at the final bill for this industrial murder. Aircraft production throughout the war. USA, 300-317. USSR, 139-261. Great Britain, 131-449. Germany, 119-331. Japan, 76-320. America produced more aircraft than Germany and Japan combined. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Allied sorties, over 14,000. German sorties, 319. Allied losses, 113 aircraft, mostly from anti-aircraft fire. German losses, control of the sky. June 1944. Allied sorties for the month, 10 times more than German. German combat losses, 931 aircraft. Number of German fighters remaining in France by end of June, 425. Willow Run. Factory area, 3.5 million square feet. Peak production, 1 bomber every 63 minutes. Total B-24s produced, 8,685, nearly half of all ever built. Peak employment, 42,000 workers. Percentage of women, up to 65% in the aviation industry. Program cost, total cost of American aviation program, approximately $45 billion in today's dollars, approximately $700 billion. Section 12, Lessons for History. Epilogue. Why Democracy Won. The story of the arsenal of democracy isn't just a story of factories and aircraft. It's a story about why totalitarian systems lose in the long run. Nazi Germany was a rigid hierarchy. Decisions were made at the top. Mistakes weren't acknowledged. Criticism was punished. When Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would destroy British aviation in a few weeks, and failed, he couldn't admit failure. When German generals understood the war was lost, they couldn't tell the Führer. The American system was chaotic, noisy, full of conflicts. Senator Truman came to Willow Run and yelled at management about delays. Journalists mocked, "Will it run?" Unions argued with management. Politicians schemed against each other. But in this chaos lay strength. When something didn't work, people said so openly. Mistakes were corrected. People were replaced. Knudsen was removed from one position and immediately given another, even more important one. When women proved capable of working in factories just as well as men, they were hired. 6 million women came to work at military enterprises. In Germany, the use of female labor began much later, and on a smaller scale, Nazi ideology demanded that women stay home. When automobile magnates and union leaders proved capable of working together, they worked together. GM, Ford, Chrysler, independent manufacturers. They all coordinated efforts under Knudsen's leadership. Germany produced excellent aircraft. The Me-262, the world's first mass-produced jet fighter, was a technological marvel. But the miracle of one genius cannot defeat a system that produces mediocre machines in unlimited quantities. As one German soldier said at the end of the war, if the plane in the sky is silver, it's American. If it's blue, it's British. If you can't see it, it's ours. Conclusion. The verdict is final and not subject to appeal. So what actually killed the Luftwaffe? Not the P-51 Mustang, though it was magnificent. Not the B-17 and B-24, though they dropped millions of tons of bombs. The Luftwaffe was killed by the assembly line. It was killed by a production line a mile long. It was killed by a Danish immigrant who worked for $1 a year. It was killed by women who learned to rivet aluminum. It was killed by a system that could acknowledge mistakes and correct them. It was killed by democracy, noisy, chaotic, seemingly inefficient, but capable of mobilizing an entire nation when necessary. Göring laughed at American refrigerators. He stopped laughing when 96 318 aircraft in a single year turned the sky over Germany into a graveyard. "We won," said Knudsen, "because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production." This wasn't just a verdict. This was a forensic audit. And the verdict was delivered on June 6, 1944, when 14,000 Allied aircraft met 319 German sorties. Case closed. If you found this breakdown valuable, hit that like button. It helps the video break through the algorithm and reach people who care about understanding how wars are actually won. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more forensic audits of historical events. And in the comments tell me, what other historical verdict would you like to see? What other catastrophe or victory should be broken down to the last digit? We'll be back.